Good morning. Let's get right into the intelligence summary for February 17th, 2026. We're tracking two major developing stories today. First, on the global stage, you've got some serious pressure building on the trade front, especially with the US. And then back home, some really fundamental questions about how we're governed and regulated are starting to bubble up. So, here's the roadmap for today's briefing. We're going to kick things off with our lead story on trade and tariffs. Then we'll hit some key macro and governance updates, jump over to the corporate intelligence brief, and then chew on a couple of big ideas from the editorial pages. We'll wrap it all up with the market close numbers. All right, let's dive into our lead story. India's trade deficit, that gap between what we buy from the world versus what we sell, it absolutely ballooned in January. And the timing on this couldn't be more critical. Because right now, a negotiating team is packing their bags for Washington to try and hammer out a new trade deal with the United States. And just look at the hard data here. I mean, this was not a small shift. It was a blowout, driven almost entirely by a surge in imports. We brought in over $71 billion worth of goods, while only sending out about $36.5 billion. That works out to a deficit of nearly $35 billion in a single month. Wow. So you might be wondering, what exactly are we buying so much of? Well, it really boils down to a few key areas. Petroleum and crude oil are at the top of the list, no surprise there, at over $13 billion. But check out what's next. A massive, and I mean massive, jump in gold imports, topping $12 billion. After that, you've got electronics and machinery rounding out the big four. And this is where things get really interesting, where the economic numbers slam right into some tricky geopolitics. See, India is hoping this US deal will offer some relief from high tariffs. But of course, there are strings attached. The word is that the deal is tied to conditions on India's oil purchases from Russia, plus a promise to buy more American goods. It's a very high-stakes balancing act for our negotiators, for sure. Okay, let's zoom out a bit to the broader picture of macroeconomics and governance. We've got 5 key updates for you here. First up, that huge 92,000 crore rupee infrastructure project on Great Nicobar Island has officially been given the green light. The National Environmental Tribunal gave its approval, pointing to the project's strategic importance. But, and this is a big but, they also ordered that every single environmental condition has to be followed to the absolute letter. Next, the Supreme Court is getting ready to weigh in on a pretty fundamental conflict: your right to privacy versus the public's right to information. People are challenging a part of the new Data Protection Act, saying it basically creates a blanket ban that guts the landmark right to information law. The stakes are so high in this one that the case is being sent to a special, larger Constitution bench. And that long-running Sabarmala Temple case, it's back in the headlines. You'll remember the original judgment was back in 2018, and then the whole thing was sent for a much larger review. Well, the Supreme Court has now scheduled new day-by-day hearings to start on April 7th, and it's being heard by a massive 9-judge bench to hopefully settle the issue once and for all. Now, shifting over to law and order in the capital, a new integrated headquarters for Delhi's elite special cell has just been announced, with a price tag of 368 crore rupees. And that's actually just one piece of a much larger investment. This was announced alongside some other initiatives, including Phase 1 of the Safe City project. All told, the new funding for these policing projects adds up to a total of 857 crore rupees. And for our final macro update, we've got an important diplomatic signal coming out of Bangladesh. The main opposition party there, the BNP, has made it clear that its relationship with India won't be held captive by past political issues. It's a pretty direct message that if they come to power, their focus will be squarely on trade and development. Okay, time to shift gears and see what's moving and shaking in the corporate world. So, we're starting with something a little weird, something you just don't see very often. Right now, the interest rate on a typical SBI home loan is about 7.25%. But the yield, the return you get, on a super safe 20-year government bond is actually higher, sitting around 7.38%. Which leads to the obvious question, right? Why on earth is a completely risk-free government bond paying out more than a home loan, which has some risk? This is definitely not how the textbooks say it's supposed to work. Well, the answer really comes down to good old supply and demand. The government, both at the central and state levels, is borrowing a ton of money right now by issuing bonds. And to get people to lend them that money, they have to offer a higher return, or yield. All of this is happening while India's total government debt is already at a pretty high 85% of our entire GDP, which just adds more pressure.
Sticking with the financial sector, the RBI is starting to crack down on something called bank assurance, and specifically the mis-selling of insurance policies. You know, when a bank employee pressures you into buying a policy you don't really need. This is a huge deal for the banks because it puts a massive annual fee pool, estimated between 22 and 25,000 crore rupees, at risk.
In major M&A news, the engineering giant Larsen & Toubro is selling its Nabha Power subsidiary over to Torrent Power. This move is a really key piece of L&T's bigger corporate strategy to get out of the business of developing new projects and instead cash in on the assets it already owns. And finally, over in the auto world, JSW MG Motor India is making a huge bet on the future of how we drive. They're pouring about $400 million into nearly tripling the production capacity at their Hollow plant. And the goal is very clear. They want to turn out way more electric and hybrid vehicles to meet that growing demand. All right, let's wrap up our main sections by looking at a couple of the big ideas being debated on the opinion pages. Two arguments in particular really stood out. First, there's a piece from Tamil Nadu's chief minister, M.K. Stalin, and he's making a pretty bold call for a structural reset of Indian federalism. And here's the core of his argument, right in this quote. He says the goal is to strengthen the central government by narrowing its focus only to truly national issues, while at the same time giving meaningful autonomy back to the states. And you should know, this isn't just an op-ed piece. It's actually based on a formal committee report that they've made public, specifically to get a national conversation started. And second, the editorial board over at Mint is tackling a massive question. Are we watching the decline of the American empire? Their conclusion is really quite nuanced. They basically argue that just comparing the US to past empires like Rome doesn't really work. Why? Because, as they put it, modern power is all about technology and institutions. And the US dollar plays a role in the world that has no historical parallel. So yeah, there are pressures, but we're looking at a completely different kind of global power. And finally, let's bring it all home with a quick look at the verified market close numbers. Okay, the Nifty 50 finished the day up 0.83%. In IPO news, Fractal Analytics closed at about 838 rupees, which is down roughly 7% from its issue price. Over in commodities, gold was up 700 rupees, but silver took a hit, down 5,000 rupees per kilo. And as we talked about earlier, that 20-year government bond yield held steady at about 7.38%. And that is the full picture for today.